The annals of military history proclaim Napoleon as one of the greatest generals of all time. The conclusive proof of this military genius was delivered on the slopes of the frozen heights of Pratzen on December 2nd, 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz. Here, Napoleon was able to use the field of battle to his advantage in a masterful way, taking full advantage of the terrain to produce a stunning and complete victory.
Napoleon planned for the Battle of Austerlitz with great meticulousness, and on the day on the field he was able to implement those plans with absolute precision.
He chose the offensive against supposedly overwhelming opposition, and by rapidity of movement and superior deployment, he outthought and he completely outfought the opposition.
Early in 1805, a coalition formed from Austria, Russia, and Britain pledged to destroy forever the destabilizing influence of revolutionary France. The hopes of the coalition were further bolstered by the intelligence that Prussia was more than likely to join the other nations in arms against Napoleon.
Napoleon had a lot of enemies. Everyone in Europe, given half a chance, would love to do Napoleon down. Napoleon is roaring across Europe, spreading the French message of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which, of course, the conservative monarchs of Europe hate. But as Napoleon continues, it becomes more and more obvious that Napoleon is not out there conquering Europe for liberty. He is out there imposing his hegemony on Europe.
The people who actually began to bring this coalition together were the British, because the British had their own reasons for wanting to remove Napoleon and Napoleonic France. These reasons had really nothing to do with the intellectual impact of French ideas on Vienna or St. Petersburg. What we were concerned about was trade and commercial relations with Europe, and we thought that France was going to interfere seriously with these. And so it is the British who begin stitching together a great coalition. It's the British who actually provide the money which is going to bring the Austrian armies and the Russian armies into Central Europe.
A series of 4 great offensives, each in a different part of Europe, were planned to be launched simultaneously. In the north, a British force, aided by Swedish and Russian elements, would attack Napoleon's ally, the Kingdom of Denmark. The next French ally to be attacked was Bavaria. Bavaria was to be invaded by the Austrian General Mack and Archduke Ferdinand with 85,000 men. Marching to join them were a further 85,000 Russians under Kutuzov. After they had combined, these forces were to seize Ulm and then strike into France through Strasbourg. Archduke Charles, with 100,000 of the best Austrian troops available to him, was to strike into northern Italy and expel the French from Lombardy before moving on to invade the south of France. Poised between Mack's force pressing onto Ulm and Archduke Charles's forces in Italy was the Austrian Archduke John, with a further 25,000 Austrians. He was to be ready to support the armies in either Germany or Italy according to how the situation developed in either theatre. The final arm of this great master plan was a combined Russian and British force from Malta, which was to be augmented by 36,000 exiled Bourbon troops from Sicily. They were to reconquer Naples from the French, then strike northwards to join Archduke Charles in the invasion of southern France.
On paper, the Allied strategic plan was a magnificent vision for a complete, coherent military strategy that took in these great 5 prongs like daggers, spearing at the heart of France from every direction you can imagine. But in practice, it was far too grandiose and it was never likely to work.
The advantage of this plan is that it makes it very difficult for Napoleon to know exactly where the main blow is going to strike. And so he's looking over a very, very broad front indeed. The disadvantage is that in the era before the telegraph, any form of modern communication, the business of coordinating these divergent thrusts is incredibly difficult.
The two theatres to the extreme north and south, involving British troops, failed to blossom into any real strategic threat. The problems of communication meant that the drive into Hanover was very slow to develop, and consequently only the Austrian armies operating against Bavaria under General Mack were operational by September. Nonetheless, they were expected to be reinforced very soon by Kutuzov, with 85,000 men marching from Russia. Despite the odds ranged against him, Napoleon was never a man to be overawed or intimidated.
At this point in Napoleon's career, he is able to ensure that he never has to fight all of his enemies at once. So in the Austerlitz campaign, Napoleon moves his army away from Boulogne, where he is getting ready to invade Britain. He races across Europe to Bohemia, to what's now the Czech Republic. And he gets stuck into the Austrians and the Russians before, for instance, his enemies, the Prussians, can figure out what's going on.
Together, the Russians and Austrians had at their disposal roughly 400,000 troops. To meet them, Napoleon could only take the field with an army of approximately 200,000. It was to be the inspired handling of these 200,000 men of the Grande Armee which was to lead to Napoleon's greatest triumph. General Mack had occupied Ulm in Bavaria on the 10th of September 1805. He expected to be joined by his Russian allies by the end of the month. However, the Russians were actually using the old style of calendar, which used a system of dating 12 days later than the rest of Europe.
The Russians adhered to Orthodox Christianity, and so their calendar came from the ancient world. In 17th century Europe, those areas which were subject to the Roman Church had reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar, and added 12 days to it. The point was that if you have two military organisations using different calendars, even if there are attempts to make sure that there is coordination, it's very easy for dates to get mistaken. The real key problem was that it meant that the Austrians thought the Russians were further forward than they were.
This effectively left the Austrian general isolated around Ulm. Recognizing this weakness, Napoleon launched a preemptive strike. Elaborate plans were laid to disguise withdrawal of his army from their camps at Boulogne, where they had been waiting to invade England. Napoleon managed to fool the Austrians into believing that the bulk of his French forces were still concentrated on the English Channel, when in fact they were already moving with great speed to cross the Rhine and encircle General Mack at Ulm. The incredibly swift movement of the French army was aided by the Grande Armee system, which Napoleon had pioneered. What Napoleon did was effectively to split his army into a series of 7 self-contained miniature armies, each of which was a balanced force of infantry, cavalry, and artillery.
The principle is you march divided and you fight united. And it also means that nobody's really sure where Napoleon is going to go. In the run-up to Austerlitz, every road in Germany has Napoleon's soldiers on it. Where are they going? Nobody knows. And this enables Napoleon to keep his enemies guessing until, when he's ready, Napoleon suddenly concentrates all of his corps at one point.
Mack was not well informed about Napoleon's movements. He was convinced that Napoleon would not be able to cross the Danube in sufficient force to threaten his forces, so he took up a position at Ulm which enabled Napoleon to surround him. And really, Mack suffered from a combination of overconfidence and lack of knowledge about his enemy.
After some fierce fighting around Ulm, in a variety of minor actions, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the situation of General Mack was hopeless. Faced with superior French forces, he held out in vain for the arrival of the Russian forces under Kutuzov. But Kutuzov was still far beyond reach. General Mack was therefore forced to surrender to Napoleon on the 20th of October. The odds against the emperor in the campaign overall were now considerably shorter. The victorious French troops, with their trophies pictured in this contemporary engraving, had captured an Austrian force of 60,000 men in exchange for only 2,000 casualties. But even in the face of this triumph, there were still more than 300,000 Allied soldiers to take care of. Kutuzov, marching slowly to aid General Mack, was astonished to learn of the fate of his ally, and he was determined that his own force should not suffer the same fate. The Russian forces therefore turned around and marched back in the direction of Poland. Napoleon immediately sent his army in pursuit, but the French were unable to pin down the retreating Russians. Nor could they prevent them from linking up with Buxhausen's forces to form a combined Allied army of Russians and Austrians, some 100,000 strong. Faced with the need to detach troops to protect an ever-lengthening supply line, Napoleon was reduced to a field army of some 78,000 men by the 17th of November. By now, he had pursued the Russian and Austrian armies 200 miles to the east of Ulm, past Znaim to Austerlitz in eastern Bohemia, and his strategic situation was becoming desperate.
He's 700 miles from France, from home territory. He's got an army which is already diminishing in effectiveness, diminishing in size. The potential for disaster is enormous.
Kutuzov and his combined Russian and Austrian forces halted their retreat and took up strong defensive positions around Olmütz, from where they warily eyed the French Grande Armee. Ragged and exhausted from 3 months of constant marching and fighting, the French forces were becoming demoralized. However, the corps d'armée system allowed Napoleon to trim his army to just 3 corps, those of Soult and Lannes, along with Murat's cavalry reserve. Yet he could still retain the ability to fight a holding battle with a reasonable prospect of success. Together, these 3 bodies comprised some 53,000 men, whom Napoleon planned to use as bait to draw in the superior Russian and Austrian forces, who, between them, had 87,000 men. Napoleon knew they would be confident of victory. Waiting nearby, however, were the corps of Bernadotte and Davout. They had strict orders to join Napoleon as battle commenced. This would bring Napoleon's strength up to 75,000 for the actual battle, at a time when it would be too late for the Allies to disengage. Napoleon therefore conceived the second brilliant scheme of the campaign.
Napoleon knew that the Allies did not have to attack him. Napoleon knew that if the Allies just strung him out further and further from France, eventually he would run out of food and ammunition, and Napoleon would go home. So Napoleon had to make the Allies attack him. And Napoleon starts to pretend weakness. Napoleon goes so far at one point as to have one of his columns retreat in disorder. He's trying to seem uncertain. He's trying to seem like he's dithering, because he wants the Allies to say, ha, finally, we have the ogre. We have Napoleon where we want him. Let's attack.
One of the main factors in Napoleon's favour was the fact that the young Russian Tsar was very impetuous and wanted to, with the rashness of youth, I suppose, wanted to take the action right to the heart of his enemy as quickly as possible and dish out a lesson.
The Emperor's plan for the battle relied on 2 factors. Firstly, enticing the enemy to do battle on the field chosen by Napoleon, and secondly, in exposing their centre to a massive counterpunch once battle had been joined.
On the 21st of November 1805, Napoleon conducts a reconnaissance along the road which runs from the village of Austerlitz to the village of Brünn. And he discovers on this road a choke point. And it's dominated on the eastern side by a series of heights. And looking at it with the eye of a superb battlefield tactician, he realizes that he can actually turn this into a killing ground. And he turns to his staff officers and he says, "Gentlemen, examine this ground carefully. It is going to be a battlefield, and you will have your part to play on it."
The outlying elements of the French army were camped in a comparatively strong position upon the Pratzen Heights, an area of high ground to the west of the town of Austerlitz. To begin the deception, Marshal Soult was ordered to abandon the town and his excellent position on the Pratzen Heights, with every indication of undue haste. After a few minor skirmishes, the Russians were quick to take the bait and followed hard on the heels of the apparently disorganized French forces. the Allies occupied the Pratzen Heights above Austerlitz on the 1st of December 1805. Allied intelligence seized upon the French retreats as proof of an impending French withdrawal. The opinion began to establish itself among the Allied commanders that Napoleon should therefore be brought to battle while he was at his weakest. The first part of Napoleon's scheme had succeeded. The Russians had occupied precisely the ground he wanted them to. With the Pratzen Heights conceded to the Allies, Napoleon intended to draw the main thrust of the Allied attack towards the apparently weak French right flank, thereby exposing its center to counterattack. This attack would be made by the Grande Armee, which was withdrawn to an area beyond the Zurlan, out of the sight of the Allied forces.
In the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon demonstrates what in French is called coup d'oeil. His eye is able to look out across the field of battle and instantly understand exactly what's going on. When Napoleon stands on the field at Austerlitz, he sees the Allied campfires. He notices that on his right, on the Allies' left, there are a lot more campfires. And based on the lie of the land, based on his knowledge of the enemy, and based on his own intuition, he realizes the Allies are going to go left flanking.
Shown here is the initial deployment of the French forces. The Zurlan and Santon were defended by the infantry and cavalry of General Lannes and Marshal Murat at the extreme north of the battlefield, while Legrand's men of Soult's corps were positioned to the south at Puntewitz. Marshal Soult was also charged with holding the center right from Kobelnitz to Sokolnitz, with further units of Legrand's division of his 4th Corps. And the late but timely arrival of Marshal Davout meant that his cavalry and leading infantry division could be deployed to the east of Telnitz in support of the all-important right flank. Krznewitz, 2 miles west of Austerlitz, was selected by Allied High Command as the Allied headquarters. There, the Russian Tsar and Austrian Emperor Francis met to agree a battle plan.
Kutuzov, the Russian general, really did not want to get involved at Austerlitz, nor did the Austrian Emperor, who preferred to wait for the Archduke Charles to come up with his troops from Italy, which would effectively doubled the available army that they have to fight Napoleon. On the other side, there was the Emperor Alexander I, a young man, only 24, and he was surrounded by young Russian aristocrats who told him they had a chance to defeat Napoleon, previously the greatest general of Europe. And he took his advice from an Austrian officer, General Weyrother, who had devised a great plan to defeat Napoleon on the day of Austerlitz.
The plan involved a massive thrust through the right of the French line between Telnitz and Sokolnitz. This drive was to be followed by a thrust northwards by 4 huge columns of troops, while a simultaneous assault on the French left flank at the Zurlan would engage their forces, thereby isolating them while the areas to the south were secured. To achieve this, however, would mean dividing the Allied army, including nearly 60,000 men given to the command of General Buxhowden, with the task of carrying out the main assault on the French right. In effect, this played straight into Napoleon's hand, as it stripped the Allied centre of men to support a bold move against the French right wing. The older and perhaps wiser men of the Allied command were unconvinced. They respected Napoleon's generalship and urged caution. But the Tsar was eventually persuaded by his younger officers of the soundness of the plan, and it was adopted.
On paper, it looks great, but Weyrother overestimated his army's ability to put a complicated plan into action. His army just wasn't good enough. Second problem is, Weyrother didn't really understand that the French would interfere with his plan. And this is always a problem with planners. They think that because their plan says we're going to do X, Y, and Z, therefore that is what you actually get to do on the day of the battle. Well, no plan, as they say, ever survives contact with the enemy. And Weyrother's plan, which looked great on paper, was just meaningless as soon as Napoleon interfered with what Weyrother wanted to do.
In the few seconds it took the Tsar to consent to Weyrother's plan, he effectively sealed the Allied fate. On the nights before the battle, Napoleon was in very good spirits and sat late into the winter nights, surrounded by his men, deep in thought, brooding upon the coming action, before sliding off into sleep, fully clothed by his campfire. As December the 2nd dawned, the men of both armies awoke to find a thick fog enshrouding the streams, villages, and rolling slopes of the battlefield. The unanticipated arrival of the fog was to give unforeseen aid to Napoleon's plan. The problems of command in the Allied army were also helping the Emperor. There was a great deal of chaos and congestion in the Allied lines, as the troops in the various columns struggled to get into position for the planned attack.
When the Allied army grouped itself for operations, they were not grouped according to what nation they came from. So in one column, you might have Austrians and Russians together under a commander that neither group really knew. They were just temporarily grouped there for the duration of the operation. Now, when you've got Russian commanders commanding Austrians and Austrian commanders commanding Russians, that's a big problem.
The difficulties of the Allied command were further evidenced by the ever-anxious Tsar.
The older and wiser generals like Kutuzov saw themselves overruled by the young Russian Tsar, who was determined to bring battle about and who actually mocked his generals in the field in front of their men, which is at best a questionable act because it's going to alienate the generals. More importantly, it's going to humble them in the front of their own soldiers, who they are going to need to lead and inspire as the battle develops.
With the harsh words of his Tsar in his ear, Kutuzov ordered the Allies to make their assault on Telnitz to the French right, exactly as Napoleon had intended. Despite the fact that the attack had been launched prematurely, a furious battle for the position developed between the troops of General Kienmeyer's Guard and General Legrand's French defenders. 9 o'clock, Telnitz and Sokolnitz lay in Allied hands. Although the capture of the villages appeared to be an important achievement for the Allies, far more significant was the clearing mist at the top of the Pratzen Heights, which revealed to Napoleon exactly what he had hoped to see. Two Allied columns converging in huge numbers upon the French right flank, inexorably weakening their center. The moment of truth was fast arriving. Despite the urging on his staff to attack, Napoleon waited for what seemed like an eternity, while two more enemy columns vacated their center. The time had arrived for Napoleon's masterstroke. Concealed in the fog still lingering at the bottom of the valley were two French divisions under Marshal Soult, some 16,000 men in all, the divisions of Vandamme and Saint-Hilaire. From within the dense fog and choking thick smoke of battle in the valley, these two divisions emerged to take the Pratzen Heights. The utterly astonished Allies were taken completely by surprise, and it was not long before the Frenchmen had surged beyond the village of Pratzen, up the incline and onto the heights themselves. The Russian Marshal Kutuzov, who had opposed the Allied plan from the beginning, was the first commander alert to the danger. But his orders for the hurried diversion of his troops from their intended destination of Sokolnitz came far too late to halt the advancing Frenchmen. The situation did indeed look bleak for the Allied center. Meanwhile, to the extreme north on the French left flank, the Allies had made their planned simultaneous attack, and a ferocious battle had developed between the cavalry of Marshal Murat and General Liechtenstein and the infantry of General Lannes and General Bagration. The fortunes of the two opposing sides ebbed and flowed, and the casualties steadily mounted as Bagration's artillery in particular exacted a heavy toll on Lannes' division. The fate of the battle to the north lay in the balance, and it was only when Marshal Murat committed his remaining regiment of cavalry to the fray that the French began to gain the upper hand. A brief Allied rally was ended by a second full-blooded charge, and before long, Lannes and Murat had succeeded in their objective of isolating the entire Allied right flank from the dramatic events in the center. Napoleon surveyed the situation at midday and was entirely satisfied with the state of battle. In addition to Murat and Lannes' achievements in the north, Marshal Soult held the recaptured Pratzen Heights, while to the south, on the beleaguered right flank, Marshal Davout had stood firm against the mighty initial Allied advance. Only unimaginable misfortune, or a miracle, could prevent the French army completing a famous victory. For the Allies, a final hope of redemption remained in the shape of the elite Russian Imperial Guard.
The Russian Imperial Guard was a superbly equipped body of men, numbering about 10,000, 2/3 infantry, 1/3 cavalry, and supported by 40 guns.
The Imperial Guard had been held back as a reserve by the Allies, and as a result, they could move rapidly to change the course of the battle when everyone else was already engaged.
It was about 1 o'clock that these precious troops were hurled in desperation upon the exhausted forces of the French General Vandamme. The Russian grenadiers were able to break through the French front lines at the point of the bayonet, but were repulsed by the murderous fire of the support divisions. Wearily, they were forced to effect an orderly retreat towards Krzenowitz to regroup. The last remaining Allied reserve, 15 divisions of the Guard cavalry, made a determined and ferocious attack on Vandamme's left and rear. Reforming behind them, the grenadiers of the Russian Guard joined in with a renewed attempt on the French front lines. Finally, this concerted pressure achieved its aim, and the French lines began to waver, scattering the battle-weary troops in all directions.
Napoleon himself was unable to stop 2 regiments of French infantry who were driven back from fleeing the battlefield. Apparently they ran past him shouting, "Vive l'Empereur, vive l'Empereur," but they were too panicky to actually obey his instructions.
The Imperial Russian Guard was the one element which looked as though it was going to destroy Bonaparte's plan, because it puts in a frontal assault right in the middle of the battlefield, right at the Pratzen Heights, and comes within an ace of actually wrecking Bonaparte's plans.
However, the rest of the Allied force was quite unable to take advantage of the Russian Guard's success.
Why doesn't Prince Bagration come from the right and take advantage of the Imperial Guard's action? Prince Bagration is engaged on the Allied right. He's fighting the French. He cannot just move away. What about the Allied left? That is where most of the Allied forces are. That is their main concentration. They are also engaged with the French. They're under attack. As soon as the Imperial Guard starts to move away, the French center turns and attacks the Allied left. Everybody in the Allied army is fighting somebody at that point. There is nobody left to take advantage of anything.
The Russian Imperial Guard made a significant impact, but unfortunately it was so enthusiastic, it was so impetuous, that it put itself into a situation where there could be an effective counterattack.
Napoleon redirected 5 squadrons of the Mamelukes from his own Imperial Guard to rescue the situation. And despite a fierce and bloody battle, the initiative was regained for the French.
Although they initially had some success, the Russian Imperial Guard weren't sufficient on their own to turn the day at Austerlitz.
At 1 o'clock, the survivors of the Russian Imperial Guard retreated in disarray, leaving behind them the Allied center, completely destroyed. All that remained now was for Napoleon to turn victory into a rout. And at 2 o'clock, the Imperial Guard, Marshal Soult's divisions, and General Oudinot's grenadiers were ordered to drive south towards Telnitz, and the forces still fighting under the Russian general Buxhowden. At the same time, the cavalry of Marshal Davout swept in to attack from the west. Buxhowden, completely cut off and with no orders from Allied High Command, issued a desperate order to split his force. His left wing retreated eastward, while the main body attempted to counter-strike to the north. But these were futile attempts, for the troops were soon overrun and forced back towards the frozen Lake Sachan. A scene of the utmost horror unfolded, as thousands of terrified Allied troops and horses desperately attempted to escape from their relentless pursuers across the frozen lake. Napoleon ordered his cannon to pound the ice, which broke into pieces, plunging screaming men and horses into the freezing waters. It was an horrific end for so many brave men. Far away from the scene of this carnage, to the north of the battlefield, the final moments of the battle had arrived. By 4:30, General Bagration had managed to extricate his men and retreat far enough from the exhausted French troops to allow hostilities to cease. Within the hour, the remainder of the field fell silent, and the Battle of Austerlitz was over. What had begun as the great Allied opportunity to find, defeat and destroy Napoleon Bonaparte had ended not only in defeat, but in catastrophe. The Allied casualty figure revealed the extent of the disaster which had befallen them.
The impact of the Battle of Austerlitz on the Allies was severe. Their armies had been effectively mauled. The Russians alone may have lost 25,000 men. 10,000 were in French hands as prisoners. The losses to the Russian Imperial Guard were never revealed, but they must have been heavy. The French claimed the capture of 45 regimental standards and 200 pieces of artillery. Effectively, the Third Coalition had been smashed, and its chief architect, William Pitt, that's the British Prime Minister, died just a month later.
And so Napoleon had completed a famous victory, a total triumph which revealed to the world his military genius. Austerlitz had been a tactical tour de force, a battle which had been fought at a time and place of Napoleon's choosing, remains a masterly illustration of the art of turning apparent total defense into devastating all-out attack.
There is no question that the Battle of Austerlitz probably remains as Napoleon's finest achievement in the field. It was the conclusive demonstration of his ability as a commander at a time when he was at the height of his powers.
The news of Austerlitz was like a nuclear explosion going off around Europe, because nothing like this had occurred before in modern history. We're talking about the very best forces that the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire can assemble, being defeated in a climactic battle with French forces which were numerically, manifestly inferior to them.
The Emperor had deceived the Allies completely, and they had rushed headlong into his carefully laid traps. The enormity of the defeat on the field, however, was as nothing compared to its consequences after it.
As soon as the battle's over, Emperor Franz of Austria is interested in getting the French army out of Austria as quickly as possible. And he no longer has an army to make them go. So Franz comes to Bonaparte and he's got nothing to bargain with. Bonaparte proceeds to cut up the Austrian Empire and give chunks to anybody he wants to pay off. He just takes Austria apart. The Russians at the same time, Russians head east. The Russians want no more of this. The Russians want to go back to Russia and worry about their own borders. And the Russians have got no stomach to keep fighting.
And so Napoleon is the master of Europe after Austerlitz. And the psychological effect on the Tsar of Russia is utterly profound. The Tsar sends a message to Napoleon by an emissary. And the message is as follows. Tell your master, I am going away. Tell him he has performed miracles.
Napoleon had indelibly stamped his mark on the affairs and fortunes of Europe, offering an ominous portent of the bloodshed which would blight the continent for the next 10 years. Above all, it established the reputation of the Grande Armee as the most effective fighting force of its age.